The locksmith's drill was the loudest sound on the quiet street, a sharp, metallic whine that felt like it was boring straight into my chest. When the cylinder finally popped out, a handful of brass shavings fell onto the welcome mat, landing right on the faded, stenciled letter of our last name. "There you go, Mrs. Vance," the man said, wiping his brow with the back of a dirty hand. "3 new deadbolts, all keyed alike. Here are your 4 copies." I took the brass keys, their edges still warm and sharp from the cutting machine, and slipped 3 of them into my coat pocket. The 4th went onto my keyring, replacing the useless piece of metal that, only 12 hours ago, had refused to turn in my own front door while my husband, Craig, watched me through the living room window and ignored my phone calls. I had spent the night sleeping in the recliner of a sterile hospital room, watching the rhythmic green blip of my mother's heart monitor, while my entire life was being quietly reconfigured behind my back. When Craig came down the stairs 5 minutes later, holding his mug of black coffee, he stopped dead at the threshold. His eyes didn't go to me first. They went to the shiny, unblemished brass of the new deadbolt, then down to the tiny pile of metal shavings on the mat. "What is this, Miriam?" His voice was flat, devoid of the panic most people would feel when caught doing something unforgivable. It was the tone he used when I forgot to buy the specific brand of coffee he liked. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "But I think the empty space on my keyring answers it for me." He took a slow sip, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. This was Craig's specialty, the quiet, immovable wall. For 7 years, whenever a disagreement arose, he didn't yell. He simply withdrew, adjusting the parameters of our life until I was the one apologizing for making a scene. When my mother suffered her stroke 3 days ago, he hadn't offered to drive me to the medical center in St. Jude. He had merely reminded me that the oil change on the station wagon was past due, and that he wouldn't be able to water my patio ferns while I was gone. "Your mother's care is going to drain what's left of your father's estate, Miriam," he said, stepping out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him as if protecting the interior from my presence. "We talked about this. I cannot have our shared assets compromised because your sister decides she wants to sue the nursing facility or hire private nurses we can't afford. I had to protect us." "By locking me out of my own home," I whispered. The neighborhood was waking up. Mrs. Gable across the street was already pulling back her sheer curtains. "By establishing a boundary," Craig corrected smoothly, reaching for his car keys. "You chose to leave the house during a critical financial discussion. I merely secured the property until we can have a rational conversation with a mediator. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a morning brief at the firm." He walked down the steps, his leather Oxfords clicking rhythmically against the concrete. He didn't look back as he got into the sedan. He assumed I would be here when he returned, chastised, exhausted from the hospital smell that clung to my hair, and ready to negotiate for my own house keys. He didn't know that while he was shifting our shared savings into a private account last night, my sister had found our mother's original, unamended safe deposit box key sewn into the lining of an old winter coat. The house was suffocatingly quiet after Craig's car turned the corner. I stood on the porch for a long minute, looking down at the shiny new key in my hand. I had the power to open the door now, but the wood felt different, cold and foreign, like a boundary marker rather than an entry to a home. When I finally turned the lock, the mechanism clicked with a heavy, expensive precision that made my stomach twist. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it 3 days ago, yet completely altered. Craig had always been meticulous, a man who aligned his shoes by color and kept his tax returns in chronological, color-coded folders. But now, his orderliness felt like a weaponized statement. My winter coat, the one I had left draped over the banister in my rush to the hospital, was gone. I found it neatly hung in the back of the coat closet, pushed behind his heavy wool trench coats where it wouldn't be seen. I sat down at the kitchen island, the marble cool against my palms. On the counter sat a single, pristine stack of papers held down by a smooth river stone Craig had brought back from a business trip to Oregon. I didn't need to lift the stone to know what they were. The top page bore the logo of a local estate planning attorney. Craig hadn't just changed the locks on a whim. He had been drafting a post-nuptial agreement while my sister and I were signing the do not resuscitate forms for our mother. My phone buzzed against the marble, the vibration sounding like a hornet in the silent kitchen. It was a text from my sister, Corin. "The bank manager says we can access the box at noon. Are you holding up?" I stared at the text until the screen went dark. Corin and I hadn't been close in years. She was the impulsive one, the sister who moved to Seattle on a dare and only called when she needed a deposit advanced. Craig had always used her instability as a shield, a cautionary tale to remind me why our finances needed to be strictly managed under his sole discretion. "We can't let Corin's chaos bleed into our stability, Miriam," he would say, his voice dripping with reasonable concern. And for years, I had nodded, letting him slowly pull the curtain down between my family and our bank accounts. I went into the downstairs bathroom to wash the hospital grime from my face. Looking in the mirror, I hardly recognized the woman staring back. The shadows under my eyes were a deep, bruised purple, and my hair was flat from hours of leaning against vinyl hospital chairs. But beneath the exhaustion, a strange, cold clarity was settling in. Craig thought he knew exactly how this script would play out. He expected me to spend the day crying, perhaps call my aunt for advice, and ultimately meet him at the kitchen table tonight, ready to sign whatever document protected his precious stability in exchange for a set of new keys and a pat on the shoulder. He didn't think I had the stamina for a prolonged conflict. He certainly didn't think I would look closely at the foundation of the house he had built around me. I walked up to our bedroom and opened the small built-in safe in the back of Craig's closet. He thought I didn't know the combination, but he had used the numerical sequence of his childhood landline, a detail he had once mentioned during a rare evening of nostalgia. The door clicked open. Inside were the deeds to the property, our marriage certificate, and a black leather ledger. As I flipped open the ledger, a small, folded piece of yellow legal paper fell out. It wasn't a bank statement or a legal brief. It was a handwritten note from his brother, dated 6 months ago, containing a phrase that made the blood rush to my ears. "If Miriam finds out about the timberland sale before the probate closes, she'll have a legal claim to half the override." I held the paper in my trembling hands, the pieces of the last year suddenly clicking into place with a terrifying, violent snap. Craig hadn't locked me out to protect our money from my mother's medical bills. He had locked me out because my mother's illness was forcing a legal audit of our family's assets, and his time had just run out. The drive to the bank was a blur of gray highway and the rhythmic, thumping sound of a loose trim piece under the station wagon's dashboard. I kept the handwritten note tucked securely inside my bra, the rough edge of the yellow legal paper scraping against my skin with every turn of the steering wheel. It felt like a physical burn, a constant reminder of the 7 years I had spent believing Craig was simply an overprotective, rigid man. Corin was already waiting on the stone steps of the First Merchants Bank, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of an oversized denim jacket that smelled faintly of clove cigarettes. She looked smaller than she had at the hospital, her shoulders hunched against the damp autumn wind. When she saw me walk up, her eyes immediately scanned my face, pausing on the dark circles under my eyes. "You look like hell, Miri," she said, her voice dropping to that low, protective register she only used when things were truly desperate. "Did Craig give you a hard time about staying at the hospital again?" "Craig changed the locks last night," I said, my voice completely level. "I had to hire a locksmith at 7 this morning just to get my medication and a clean pair of pants." Corin stopped dead on the threshold of the bank, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "He did what? While Mom is sitting in the ICU? Miriam, tell me you're calling a lawyer. Tell me you're not just letting him get away with." "I'm not letting him do anything," I interrupted, grabbing her elbow and pulling her through the heavy brass double doors of the bank. The warmth of the lobby hit us, carrying the familiar, stale scent of old paper, floor wax, and air conditioning. "But we need to open that box first. Right now, he thinks he has all the cards. I need to know exactly what's in Mom's name before he realizes I found the ledger." The bank manager, a woman named Mrs. Gable whose spectacles hung from a beaded chain around her neck, led us down a narrow concrete staircase into the basement vault. The air down here was cooler, heavy with the silence of decades of locked secrets. She checked our IDs against my mother's signature card, her movements agonizingly slow, before inserting her master key into box number 412. She turned her wrist, then stepped back to let me insert the old brass key we had cut from my mother's coat lining. The lock gave way with a heavy, metallic clunk. When I pulled the long metal box out of its sleeve and set it on the viewing table, Corin's breath caught. We both expected old savings bonds, perhaps our grandmother's pearl necklace, or the deed to the small cedar cabin our father had bought in the 70s. Instead, the box was nearly empty. Sitting at the very bottom was a thick, blue legal folder, and a single, unsealed envelope addressed to me in our mother's shaky, arthritic handwriting. I opened the envelope first. The letter was dated only 3 weeks ago, just days before her stroke. "Miriam," it read, the ink smudged in places where her hand must have rested heavily on the paper. "Craig came to the house when you were at the grocery store last month. He asked me to sign a quitclaim deed for the timberland inheritance, told me it was the only way to shield your future income from Corin's tax liens. I didn't trust his eyes, Miri. I told him I'd think about it. The next day, I found out he had already listed the parcel under a shell company called Vance Holdings. Don't sign anything he gives you. Look at the blue folder. I love you." I reached for the blue folder, my fingers numb. Inside were the certified public records of a land transfer Craig had executed using a forged power of attorney, bearing my mother's misspelled middle name. "Miri," Corin whispered, looking over my shoulder at the documents. "What does it mean?" "It means," I said, the cold clarity in my chest hardening into something sharp and absolute, "that my husband didn't just lock me out of our house. He's been stealing my family's land for a year, and he thinks my mother is going to die before anyone notices." Silence in the bank vault was absolute, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Corin reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the edge of the blue folder. "Vance Holdings," she muttered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "That bastard. He's been treating Mom like a cash cow while acting like I'm the liability." "He needed us divided," I said, the realization settling into my bones like a deep chill. "As long as you and I weren't speaking, as long as I believed your chaos was a threat to our survival, I would never look at the books. I would just trust him to handle the family estate." I carefully placed the blue folder and our mother's letter into my canvas tote bag, zipping it shut with a deliberate, slow movement. The anger inside me wasn't hot. It was a cold, calculating force. For 7 years, Craig had made me feel small, convincing me that my value lay in my compliance, in my ability to keep a quiet house and never question his financial architecture. Now, looking at the forged signature on the deed, I realized his precision wasn't a sign of intelligence. It was the frantic housekeeping of a thief. "What's the plan, Miri?" Corin asked as we walked back up the concrete stairs into the bright afternoon light. "Are we going to the police? We have the forgery right here." "No," I said, stopping on the sidewalk. The wind caught the collar of my coat, forcing me to tuck my hair behind my ears. "If we go to the police now, he hires a high-priced defense attorney, ties this up in corporate litigation for 5 years, and uses our shared marital funds to pay his legal fees. He'd freeze everything. We wouldn't be able to afford Mom's care, let alone a long court battle." "Then what?" "He thinks I'm currently at the hospital, weeping over Mom's bedside, completely broken by the new locks," I said, looking out at the traffic. "He expects me to come home tonight begging for peace. I'm going to give him exactly what he expects." I told Corin to go back to the hospital, to sit with Mom and keep her phone close. Then, I drove back to the house. When I pulled into the driveway at 4 o'clock, Craig's sedan wasn't there yet, but the shadow of the house across the lawn felt heavy, ominous. I unlocked the front door with my new brass key, stepping into the foyer. The smell of the new varnish on the deadbolts lingered in the air. I didn't take off my coat. I went straight to Craig's home office, the one room in the house I was always expected to knock before entering. The room was dark, the heavy mahogany blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun. On his desk sat his secondary laptop, the one he used for personal consultations. It was password protected, of course, but Craig was a man of strict habits. He never used a random string of characters. He used numbers that held historical significance for him. I tried his graduation year combined with his mother's maiden name. Incorrect. I tried the date of his first major promotion at the firm. Incorrect. I paused, my hand hovering over the keyboard. I thought back to the note from his brother about the override from the timberland sale. The date on that note was 6 months ago. I closed my eyes, remembering a night back in October when Craig had come home unusually cheerful, buying an expensive bottle of wine we couldn't afford, claiming he had simply closed a minor account. I typed in the date of that dinner, 10/24. The screen flashed, then dissolved into his desktop. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the file manager. There, nested inside a folder labeled Horticulture Ferns, was a subfolder titled VH Exec. I opened the top document, a spreadsheet tracking the projected payouts from the timberland clearance. My eyes scanned the columns until they landed on a name listed under the consultant fees distribution list. It wasn't his brother. It was the name of the supervising physician at my mother's care facility. The name on the spreadsheet seemed to blur before my eyes, Dr. Eris Thorne. He was the neurologist who had signed the medical assessment declaring my mother mentally incompetent just 2 days before her stroke. The exact document Craig needed to activate the power of attorney. According to the ledger, Dr. Thorne's consulting fee was scheduled to be wired into an offshore account the moment the timberland sale finalized at the end of the month. I sat back in Craig's leather office chair, the room suddenly feeling ice cold. It wasn't just a financial crime anymore. This was a coordinated, predatory ambush. They had isolated my mother, manipulated her medical records, and were now waiting for her to slip away so they could divide the carcass of her life's work. And Craig had locked me out of the house because he needed 24 hours of uninterrupted access to this computer to clear the final transfer traces before the probate court took over. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat. I hadn't heard the garage door open. I scrambled to minimize the window, my fingers slick with sweat against the tracking pad. I closed the laptop lid just as the office door swung open. Craig stood in the threshold, his briefcase dangling from his left hand, his tie loosened just a fraction. He didn't look angry to find me sitting in his chair. Instead, a slow, patronizing smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the look of a chess player who had just realized his opponent was moving exactly where he wanted her to. "I didn't expect you back so early, Miriam," he said, stepping into the room and setting his briefcase on the edge of the mahogany desk. "I thought you'd be at the hospital until visiting hours ended." "The doctor said she needs rest," I said, my voice sounding hollow, terrified, and small. I intentionally let my shoulders slump, playing the part of the broken, defeated wife he expected to find. I couldn't stay there anymore, Craig. The smell of the place was making me sick." He sighed, a soft, performative sound of sympathy, and walked around the desk. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, squeezing it just tightly enough to feel the pressure of his fingers against my collarbone. "I told you it would be too much for you. You always carry more emotional weight than you can handle, Miri. That's why I'm here, to handle the heavy lifting." I looked down at his shoes, focusing on the pristine shine of his leather Oxfords to keep from throwing up. "The locks, Craig. Why did you do that?" "We've been over this," he said gently, his tone shifting into that smoothly condescending rhythm he used when explaining our taxes. "With Corin hovering around like a vulture, I couldn't risk her coming here while you were distracted, looking for Mom's jewelry or financial documents. I had to secure the perimeter. For us. I did it for us, Miriam." "I see," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut to squeeze out a single, genuine tear of pure rage. "I brought back the extra keys the locksmith made. I'll leave them on the counter." "Good girl," he said, patting my shoulder before letting his hand drop. "Now, why don't you go upstairs and take a bath? You smell like antiseptic. I'll order some takeout, and we can look over those estate planning papers I left on the counter. We need to sign them tonight so I can protect your interests tomorrow." I stood up, keeping my head down, and walked past him into the hallway. But as I reached the stairs, My hand tightened around the canvas tote bag still slung over my shoulder. Inside that bag was a flash drive. And on that flash drive was a complete, unedited copy of his horticulture ferns folder. The bathwater was hot enough to turn my skin a blotchy, painful red, but I barely felt it. I stared at the bathroom door, listening to the muffled, heavy thud of Craig's footsteps down in the kitchen. Every sound he made, the clink of a fork, the opening of the refrigerator, the low hum of his voice as he took a brief phone call, felt like a physical threat. I leaned my head back against the cold porcelain of the tub and closed my eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were terrifyingly clear now. Craig wasn't just a greedy husband trying to skim some money from his mother-in-law's estate. He was deeply entrenched in a fraud that required my mother to remain incapacitated. Dr. Thorne hadn't just misdiagnosed her. He had actively facilitated the legal theft of her timberland by declaring her legally incompetent. If my mother woke up, or if a different doctor reevaluated her, the entire house of cards would collapse on Craig's head. I climbed out of the tub, dried myself off with a towel that felt as rough as sandpaper, and pulled on a thick, oversized sweater. I needed the layers. I felt cold from the inside out. When I came downstairs, the kitchen smelled of garlic and cheap plastic containers from the local Thai place Craig always ordered from when he didn't want to cook. The stack of estate planning documents was sitting next to his plate, the smooth river stone resting on top like a paperweight on a death warrant. "Feel better?" Craig asked without looking up from his phone. He was texting someone, his thumb moving with a rapid, practiced rhythm. "A little," I lied, sitting across from him. I pushed a container of noodles around with my fork, pretending to have an appetite. "Did you manage to get everything sorted with the firm today?" "Mostly," he said, finally setting his phone face down on the table. He reached over and tapped the blue legal folder he had prepared for me. "But we really need to get this taken care of, Miri. I spoke with the firm's probate specialist this afternoon. He confirmed that if Corin tries to file for temporary guardianship of Mom's estate, she can tie up our personal accounts in probate court for months. This post-nuptial agreement simply segregates our marital assets, so her legal drama can't touch what we've built." He handed me a heavy, silver sleek pen, the one I bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. "Just sign on the sticky notes," he said, his voice dropping into that soothing, hypnotic tone he used when he was manipulating me. "I'll handle the filing tomorrow morning. It's one less thing for you to worry about while you're spending your days at the hospital." I picked up the pen. It felt incredibly heavy in my hand. I flipped to the first signature page. The text was dense, but my eyes caught a clause nestled deep in the boilerplate language. The parties agree that any property inherited by Miriam Vance during the marriage shall be managed exclusively by Craig Vance as sole trustee. He wasn't just shielding our assets from Corin. He was setting it up so that the moment my mother passed away, the timberland money would flow directly into an account I had zero legal access to. "Craig," I said softly, looking up at him through my eyelashes, making sure my eyes looked wide and uncertain. "Are you sure this is the only way?" "Miriam," he said, his face hardening just a fraction, the mask slipping for a split second. "I changed the locks to protect us. Don't make me regret trying to look out for your future. Just sign the papers." I looked down at the paper, then back at his face. I held his gaze for 3 long seconds, letting him see the exact moment I chose to give him what he wanted. I lowered the pen to the page and signed my name on the first line. He didn't see the tiny, vibrating alert on my phone screen, which was tucked under my napkin. It was a text from Corin at the hospital. "Miri, Mom's eyes just opened. She's trying to speak." The silver pen scratched against the paper 2 more times as I signed the remaining pages. Each signature felt like a deliberate drop of blood spilled to keep Craig blind to the real movement on the board. When I pushed the document back across the marble counter, his hand shot out, snatching it up with an eagerness he couldn't quite mask under his usual composed exterior. "Thank you, Miri," he said, blowing gently on the fresh ink before closing the folder. "You've done the right thing. Believe me, when this is all over, you'll see that I was only looking out for our peace of mind." "I know," I whispered, pulling my hands into the sleeves of my sweater to hide their shaking. "I'm just so tired, Craig. I think I'm going to go to bed early." "Go ahead. I have a few emails to wrap up down here anyway," he said, already pulling his laptop out of his briefcase. He didn't look up as I left the kitchen. He was already drowning in the numbers, counting the wealth he believed he had just legally locked away. I crept up the stairs, each creak of the old wood sounding like an alarm in my ears. The moment I reached the bedroom, I locked the door behind me, pulled my phone from my pocket, and called Corin. I squeezed myself into the small gap between the bed and the window, keeping my voice down to a jagged whisper. "Corin, is she conscious?" "Miri," Corin's voice came through the line, thick with tears, but for the first time in years, she sounded entirely sober, entirely present. "She's awake. She can't move the right side of her face very well and her speech is slurred, but she's clear. The first thing she muttered when the nurse left the room was Craig's paperwork. She knows what he did, Miri." "Listen to me very carefully," I said, my chest tightening as I looked out at the dark, moonlit driveway. "Who is the attending physician on duty tonight?" "It's a Dr. Vance. No, wait, that's your name. It's Dr. Patel. Why?" "Thank God," I breathed. "Dr. Thorne isn't there. Corin, I need you to find Dr. Patel right now. Tell him our mother needs an immediate, independent neurological evaluation recorded on video, and specify that we want her alertness and cognitive function documented before the morning shift change. Do not let Dr. Thorne near her room tomorrow morning. If Thorne gets to her before we have an independent record, he'll sedate her again and claim it was a medical necessity." "I'm on it," Corin said, the old, stubborn fire in her voice flaring up. "Miri, what are you doing over there? Are you safe?" "Craig has the signed post-nuptial," I said, staring at my reflection in the dark window pane. "He thinks he won. He's going to initiate the final Timberland wire transfer to Vance Holdings first thing in the morning. I'm going to let him do it." "But if he transfers the money?" "If he transfers the money based on a forged power of attorney while Mom is documented as conscious and objecting, it ceases to be a civil dispute over an estate," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "It becomes interstate wire fraud and grand larceny. He won't just be dealing with a messy divorce, Corin. He'll be dealing with a federal prosecutor." I hung up the phone and sat in the dark bedroom, listening to the quiet, rhythmic clicking of Craig's keyboard from the kitchen below. He was working late into the night, carefully moving the digital chess pieces into place, completely unaware that the board had just been flipped upside down. The sun hadn't even cleared the horizon when Craig's side of the bed went cold. I lay perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the pale gray square of the window, listening to the familiar mechanical routine of his morning. The shower hummed through the pipes. The closet door clicked. Downstairs, the espresso machine hissed, venting a sharp burst of steam that sounded like a held breath finally being released. I waited until I heard the heavy front door click shut and the low rumble of his sedan backing down the driveway before I finally sat up. My phone was already glowing on the nightstand. It was an email from Corin, sent at 3:14 a.m. Attached was a 3-minute video file. I clicked play with a trembling thumb. The video was shaky, filmed under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the ICU. My mother was propped up against a mountain of stiff hospital pillows, a clear oxygen cannula beneath her nose. Her left hand was resting over Corin's, her knuckles white. Dr. Patel stood to the side, holding a clipboard and speaking in a calm, measured cadence. "Mrs. Vance, can you tell me the year?" Dr. Patel asked. 2026, my mother whispered, her voice thick and dragging on the consonants, but her gaze was fierce, locked onto the camera lens. "And do you know who Craig Vance is?" My mother's chest rose and fell with a ragged breath. "My daughter's husband, he came to my house. He wanted my land. I told him no. I never signed his papers." I closed the video, a hot tear spilling over my lower lid and dropping onto the cold glass of the screen. It was all there. The cognitive baseline, the explicit denial of consent, the timeline firmly established before Craig could execute his morning trades. I dressed quickly in a pair of dark slacks and a simple wool sweater, grabbed my canvas tote bag containing the flash drive and my mother's real documents, and walked down into the kitchen. On the counter, right next to the empty espresso cup, Craig had left a small, handwritten sticky note next to my car keys. Taking the sedan for service after my 9 a.m. meeting. Use the station wagon. Don't forget to water the ferns. Even now, he couldn't resist a tiny, controlling nudge. I drove straight to the offices of Miller and Vance, the corporate law firm where Craig was a junior partner. The lobby was all brushed steel and expensive glass, designed to make ordinary people feel insignificant the moment they stepped off the elevator. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly smooth bun, looked up with a practiced smile that quickly faltered when she saw the look in my eyes. "Good morning. I'm Miriam Vance. I need to see Harold Miller immediately," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the morning air conditioning. "Oh, Mrs. Vance," she hesitated, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Mr. Miller is currently in a closed briefing with your husband and the probate committee. I can page Craig for you." "No," I said, leaning over the granite desk, my voice dropping to a low, absolute whisper. "You're going to page Mr. Miller, and you're going to tell him that if he doesn't open that conference room door in the next 60 seconds, the federal notification for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement will be delivered to the local news desk before his lunch hour." Receptionist's face drained of color so quickly I thought she might faint. Her fingers flew across her console, her voice a terrified whisper as she muttered into her headset. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy frosted glass doors at the end of the hall swung open, and Harold Miller himself stepped out. He was a silver-haired man in a bespoke three-piece suit, the kind of lawyer who handled generational wealth and corporate secrets with the quiet discretion of a priest. "Miriam," he said, his voice smooth but alert as he guided me into a private side office, away from the receptionist's prying ears. "What is the meaning of this? Craig is in the middle of an essential asset restructuring meeting for your family." "Craig is in the middle of a felony, Harold," I said, sitting down in one of the leather armchairs without being asked. I reached into my canvas tote bag and pulled out the flash drive, along with a printed copy of the spreadsheet I had taken from Craig's computer the night before. I slid them across the polished desk. That spreadsheet details a systematic embezzlement of my mother's timberland estate, rooted through a shell company called Vance Holdings. Harold frowned, adjusting his spectacles as he looked down at the paper. "Miriam, Craig assured the board that your mother had legally signed over these management rights before her stroke to protect the family from." "My husband forged her signature using a fake power of attorney," I interrupted, my voice completely steady, carrying a weight that made Harold freeze. "And if you look at column 4, you'll see that he has been paying consulting fees to Dr. Eris Thorne, the very neurologist who signed the declaration of incompetence to validate that forgery." Harold's eyes scanned the document, his jaw tightening as he reached the line containing Dr. Thorne's offshore wiring instructions. A seasoned corporate lawyer knows the exact moment a situation crosses from a messy domestic dispute into a structural catastrophe for his firm. If Miller and Vance processed a multi-million-dollar wire transfer based on a fraudulent document, the firm's liability would destroy them. "Where is your mother now, Miriam?" Harold asked, his voice dropping its paternal warmth, replaced by a cold, sharp legal precision. "She woke up last night," I said, pulling out my phone. I hit play on the video of my mother and laid the screen face up on the desk between us. Harold watched the video in complete silence. He didn't look up when my mother's slurred voice explicitly stated she had never signed Craig's papers. He didn't look up when Dr. Patel verified the date and time. When the video ended, Harold slowly took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Craig is in conference room B right now," Harold said softly, looking at the wall clock. "The wire transfer to Vance Holdings was initiated at 9 o'clock. It is currently pending final partner approval." "Then I suggest you come with me," I said, standing up and pulling my tote bag over my shoulder. "Because I'm going to go tell my husband that his access has been revoked." Doors to conference room B didn't make a sound as Harold Miller pushed them open. Inside, Craig was leaning over a massive glass table, a sleek silver laptop open in front of him. Two senior partners sat to his left, casually reviewing a stack of paperwork while sipping coffee from porcelain cups. The atmosphere was calm, professional, and dripping with affluent security. When Craig looked up and saw me standing next to the senior partner, his face didn't register fear, only a deep, irritated exhaustion. He closed his laptop halfway, a condescending sigh escaping his lips. "Miriam," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, practiced note of public patience. "What are you doing here? We discussed this. I'm in the middle of a highly sensitive legal closing. Go wait in the car and we can discuss whatever is upsetting you at home." "The locks have been changed, Craig," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls, entirely devoid of the small, broken cadence I had used at the kitchen table last night. "But this time, you're the one on the outside." Craig stood up, his jaw tightening as he looked at Harold. "Harold, I apologize for my wife. She's been under an immense amount of emotional stress due to her mother's illness. She's not rational right now." "Sit down, Craig," Harold said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of an anvil dropping onto the glass table. Craig froze, his eyes darting between Harold and the printed spreadsheet I was holding in my hand. For the first time in 7 years, I watched a crack appear in his pristine, unmovable wall. The color slowly drained from his throat, rising to his ears in a patchy, frantic flush. "The wire transfer has been flagged and permanently canceled," I said, walking to the edge of the table and laying the copy of his horticulture ferns file directly over his closed laptop. "Dr. Patel took a full video statement from my mother last night. Her cognitive functions are intact, and the state medical board has already been notified about Dr. Thorne's consulting fees. The federal authorities have the routing numbers for Vance Holdings." The two senior partners looked down at the spreadsheet, then quietly pushed their chairs back from the table, physically distancing themselves from Craig as if he were suddenly contagious. "Miriam," Craig whispered, his voice finally losing its smooth, hypnotic rhythm. It sounded thin, ragged, and terrified. He reached across the table toward my hand, his fingers trembling. "Miriam, think about what you're doing. We can fix this. We can talk about this at home. I did this for our family, for our stability." "I am thinking about my family," I said, stepping back so his fingers only touched the cold glass of the table. "I'm thinking about my mother, who built a life that you tried to steal while she was gasping for air in an ICU. And I'm thinking about myself." I turned toward the door, stopping only to look back at him one last time. He looked incredibly small sitting in that massive leather chair, surrounded by the expensive, hollow architecture of the life he had used to cage me. "My sister is waiting for me at the hospital," I said quietly. "The keys to the house are on your desk. Don't bother coming back. The locks have already been changed." An hour later, I was sitting in the hospital room, holding my mother's warm, fragile hand while Corin quietly peeled an orange by the window. The room still smelled of antiseptic, but the heavy, suffocating weight that had followed me for years was gone. As the autumn rain began to tap softly against the glass, I closed my eyes and breathed in the quiet, absolute freedom of a home that was finally my own.